This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
You lost all constitutional rights the moment you walked through that door. When the judge sat down there, I sentenced you to 10 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. You walked in that door, you was a number. And the inmates understood that.
If you're out there and live past the period of being here, just lay down and do it.
Those inmates that were here in the institution during an execution, it had an impression on them that maybe was still with them to some extent. Maybe they don't think about it anymore, but it had an impression on them, I'm sure.
They wouldn't let me out until I get back to stuff. 7 months later, I give it back to them.
That was one of the problems we ran into. You had 5 or 6 guys that were sitting in a place, smoking and joking and drinking coffee. Pretty quick, they'd hatched a plan in there to get under your skin some way or try to figure a way out.
Welcome, everyone, back to Behind Gray Walls, a podcast about the old Idaho State Penitentiary and the men and women who spent time here. I am Skye, so things are a little bit different if you're a regular listener. I am, unfortunately, a little remote still, but I'm talking to Anthony and Sam, who are together at the old pen. How's it going, guys?
Good. How are you doing, Skye?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. How about you guys?
Doing good, just busy.
Just getting through Locktober season. It's been
Yeah.
a busy, successful year for us at the pen.
You guys are killing it out there, man. I'm so proud of you guys. Which, I don't know, feels funny for me to say. I just was this, little kid who wanted to work at the penitentiary and then left and was able to do it remotely still. I don't know. I feel so connected to the site, and yet I have not been back in close to a year.
Skye, I can't even tell you how much I use your notes. It's like your ghost haunts me every day.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to find something about a woman. I'm like, let's go and check what Skye wrote.
Totally. Or if I have just a thought like, I wonder if anybody, and I just go through your notes quickly and here we go. Here's a good example of this.
Yeah.
Seriously use them all the time.
Oh, thanks, you
So
guys.
in
Well,
some
I'm
ways
so
it
glad.
feels like you haven't left, even though we miss you being here and present, of course.
Your physical body.
we still see a lot of your academic side here at the site.
Your voice remains. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, there is nothing I've ever wanted more than to be a ghost haunting everyone all the time. So this is actually really great news for me. But as we said, today's a little bit different. We've all been busy, and so we've been able to sort of step in where others don't have the opportunity to present. But today we're going to just be regaled by Sam, who, as we know, is an excellent storyteller, because he did. Sam, remind me how many pages of research you had?
We had over 500 on this guy. This puts my other ones to shame this year.
I wrote an entire dissertation, and I don't think I had 500 pages of notes on my dissertation. That's crazy.
Yeah.
One cool thing about this project, by the time this episode releases, the Owyhee Outlook will actually publish an article from us at the Historical Society based on this research. They were able to collaborate with us. You can read this in story form, or much better, you can listen to it in podcast form.
Yeah.
Man, you guys are killing it.
It's been so fun. Sam will be like, Anthony, check this out. And every day for how many months have you been working on this project?
Too long, 5 months. It's been forever.
He's been
forever
working so hard on covering this story, and it's a wild story, and this will hopefully be a movie or something someday following Springer. Oh my gosh!
Well, I'm so excited. Let's hear it.
During its 101 years of operation, the Old Idaho Penitentiary saw many different wardens. For some serving in this role as a political appointment, this position would be their one and only sojourn into law enforcement. For others, however, their work as a warden was just one chapter in an entire career dedicated to law enforcement. Naturally, some of our earliest wardens were among the toughest, like Joseph Pinkham and Orlando Rube Robbins, who made significant impacts not only on the prison but on Idaho as a whole. John Springer, however, stands as one of our least known wardens, serving for less than a year, yet his career as a sheriff in Idaho left behind a lasting legacy that reflected his personal values. In the history of the American West, many of the most famous lawmen had prior experience as gunslingers. It was widely believed that speed and accuracy with a gun were essential, not just to successfully enforcing the law, but to ensuring one's own survival. Then you have men like John Springer, who stand in direct contrast to everything we've come to imagine about an Old West sheriff. John defied stereotypes and challenged the preconceived notions of what it meant to maintain law and order in a dangerous boomtown. Join us as we head to Silver City, where we'll encounter mining wars, revenge in the saloons, and love stories in some of the most unexpected places. I hope you all can be fearless in the face of adversity, because today's episode is going to be the adventure of a lifetime. The October of 1852 had been unusually warm, with those in New York describing the weather as summer-like. However, the ocean spray coming off the waves of Cape Elizabeth surely remained as cold as ever. The schooner Gazelle, a ship sailing on behalf of the flag's merchant fleet, cut through the tides with the wind in its sails. Whoever first spotted the commotion is unclear, but someone noticed something splashing in the water, something big. As the ship drew closer, the crew could see blood spreading in the thrashing waves. In the water before them, a whale and a swordfish were locked in a desperate battle. At first, the men watched in awe as the two massive sea creatures tore, bit, and stabbed at one another. Crew decided they needed to act quickly they wanted to capture the victor. They swiftly lowered a boat into the water and paddled towards the titanic mammal. Upon reaching it, they found the young whale to be about 30 feet long. The crew prepared the harpoon. One sailor recounted,
"At this, a portion of the crew of the Gazelle lowered a boat and running alongside him, succeeded in throwing a harpoon into him, capturing him. His body bore the marks of the severe manner in which the thrasher and swordfish had handled him."
The excitement felt by the crew of the Gazelle must have been immense, especially considering that the schooner's primary purpose was not hunting whales, but transporting cargo from Augusta to Boston. However, no one on board that day wanted to pass up such a prime opportunity. In 1846, the command of the ship rested on the shoulders of Captain Elijah Springer. Born in Maine in 1801, Captain Springer married Eliza Alice Davidson in 1833. Together, they had 9 children in Augusta. Their 6th child, a boy named John Davidson Springer, was born on April 22nd, 1846. Although few documents detailed Johnny Springer's youth, we can make a few educated guesses based on the information we do have available. Most families in Maine were hardworking, religious, and highly independent. Captain Elijah Springer was a member of the Whig Party before the Civil War and served as a town constable in 1859. These roles likely influenced young Johnny's political views and his future career as a lawman. The captain also had a great passion for racing horses. It's easy to imagine that Johnny's lifelong love of horses began in his youth, perhaps even from atop his father's shoulders at the racetrack. However, it's doubtful that John Springer had much time for recreation. In addition to attending school, 1840s Maine, children were expected to work. While farm labor and chores were common across America, in seafaring towns, children as young as 7 were often allowed to work on ships. John undoubtedly served on his father's ship, likely for the better part of a decade. His oldest brother, Elijah Jr., followed in his father's footsteps and became a sea captain in Maine. Not everyone in the family chose this career path. In 1857, at age of 17, John's older brother, Amos, left for California. 8 years later, at age 20, John, at his brother's encouragement, decided to head west. Johnny Springer did not cross the Great Plains in a covered wagon. During the California Gold Rush, travelers had 3 main options for their journey: crossing the country via the Oregon and California trails, sailing below South America near Cape Horn, or traveling the Isthmus of Panama, Johnny chose the latter. If Johnny Springer traveled to Panama by boat, the first leg of the journey would have been a minimum of 2,500 miles to Central America. Once in Panama, it involved a 75-mile journey up the Charges River, followed by a 25-mile trek by mule to Panama City, and then another 5,000 miles by boat to San Francisco. The expedition took travelers deep into the rainforest, where many succumbed to yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery. Like all routes, this one also posed the risk of highwaymen preying on those headed west in search for gold. Upon arriving in the beautiful California Bay, Johnny did not stay long. He packed his bags again, traveling another 584 miles by stage to Silver City. The Owyhee Mountains were the ancestral hunting grounds for the Shoshone, the Bannock, and the Paiute Nation for over 13,000 years. For centuries, they lived and hunted in this area. As early as 1812, the native people began encountering mountain men encroaching on their hunting grounds in search of furs. These mountain men came from a diverse background. Donald Mackenzie's Snake Expedition, which traveled through the region in 1818, included French Canadians, Iroquois, and Hawaiians who had journeyed to the United States on missionary ships. After several Hawaiian mountain men disappeared in the Idaho mountain range during the winter of 1819, the area earned the nickname Owyhee, a word used interchangeably with Hawaii at the time. Many flocked to Idaho after the discovery of gold in 1860. Michael Jordan's discovery of gold in the Owyhees in 1863 only added to the rush. Overnight, Ruby City sprang up and immediately began to boom. However, when richer minerals veins were discovered at War Eagle Mountain a mile farther up the road in 1864, Ruby City began to dismantle board by board as miners transported their houses up the road to construct Silver City, including an abundance of brothels and saloons. To address the lawlessness, locals elected Lyman Stanford as the first sheriff of Owyhee County. However, after misappropriation of city funds and tax revenue, he left the position, and Johnny's brother, Amos Springer, replaced him in 1866. Amos's election as sheriff was remarkable, particularly because he did not support the Confederacy, unlike many others in Owyhee County at the time. Community members may have overlooked their political differences with the 26-year-old Amos due to his reputation as a fearless deputy. In September of the previous year, a miner named Hargrave stabbed Tom Wilson to death in a house of ill repute. Amos's ability to apprehend Hargrave earned him the respect and likely secured his position as sheriff. The Idaho statesman described John's brother as follows: "He was all man, which his face indicated, and the desperados, thieves, gunmen, and bad men generally learned that Springer was the master of the situation, but not until they had thoroughly tested his courage, strength, and skill." Despite Amos's talent, the job of bringing law to Silver City would have been no easy task. Author R.J. Robertson ranked Silver City as one of the most dangerous towns in the entire West, saying, "The Idaho Territory had its share of rowdy towns. The mining centers of Idaho City and Silver City competed with Deadwood and Tombstone, not only for the amount of rich ore their citizens produced, but also for the number of hard men they attracted." By the invitation of his brother Amos, this was the city Johnny arrived at in 1866, at the age of 20. Over the past 6 months, Johnny had seen places in Central America and California unlike anything back home in Maine, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would find in this Idaho boomtown. A town composed of brothels, bars, and public fights, some of which were even sanctioned. The year Johnny arrived, James Dyer and Patsy Foy engaged in one of the most famous prize fights in Owyhee history. These two pugilists faced off and exchanged hit for 84 rounds.
No way.
Oh,
No
how
way.
long are these rounds?
These are rounds where they literally, it's not like, okay, we go 12 rounds and whoever wins, wins. It's like, you win if you are the one left standing. It is
Correct.
insane.
Until someone goes down, until a knockout. And so like the 15 rounds that we get in Queensberry doesn't start for a couple more years. And then even longer before it's enforced. So these early Western prize fights would really go until someone collapses or someone gets knocked out.
It's horrible. I had to read about like early boxing for my comprehensive exams, and I cannot imagine, even if there was padding, 84 rounds.
Dyer finally won the fight after 2 hours and 5 minutes of brutal combat.
2 hours of boxing?
2 hours.
Oh, give me 2 minutes and I'm going to be like, I'm done for the week. Okay.
Literally.
For this feat, he earned a purse of $500, which would be just under $10,000 in modern currency.
Wow. Okay, I would keep fighting. All right.
One has to wonder if Johnny saw this fight, and if he did, what he thought of it, what he thought of Silver City as a whole. Johnny arrived there to work as a miner, but within the first year, he found himself deputized as a posse member and later a deputy sheriff to help provide support in dangerous situations. Little did his brother Amos know he would soon need all the help he could get. Many mining towns proved to be less profitable than advertised, causing a boom-to-bust cycle that created ghost towns all across the West. But the mineral wealth found at Silver City surpassed everyone's wildest expectations. Soon, powerful mining companies began to push out independent miners to set up shafts and large-scale operations. Two such mines were the Ida Elmore mine, owned by David F. Fogus and John Marin Moore, which sat adjacent to the Golden Chariot mine owned by Hillary Hill Becky Gayson and Company. These two mining claims actually did overlap, a fact that was at first overlooked due to the groups mining at different depths. But as the earth divided, their shafts began to diminish. Each party agreed to have a neutral barrier to ensure everyone's safety and protection of their mineral wealth. However, neither side kept their promise, and in February 1868, the miners broke through the wall that separated them. The vein of wealth rested between the two mines. Miners reported it to contain
some of the richest ore ever seen, both silver and gold in large quantities. Pure native silver held together by leaves and threads of gold.
Compromise between the two interests was no longer an option.
Oh no.
Each group quickly fortified their mines with sandbags and trenches. The miners armed themselves and loaded up with ammunition, and on March 11th, the war on the mountain began. Lights were extinguished to hide their location inside the dark shafts, with only brief flashes of gunpowder illuminating the rocky earth as each party unloaded a volley on the other. John R. McBride described the exchange, saying, quote,
"Whenever a light appeared in the works on one side, it was greeted by a fusillade from the other."
Fighting in the pitch black is no easy task. Sam Dunson shot off his own foot with a shotgun.
Oh my gosh.
The battle continued for weeks. When bullets failed to find their mark in the dark, the men resorted to using hand grenades.
No, what is happening?
On March 25th, John C. Holgett, an owner of the Golden Chariot, led a charge in the Elmore. He and his men were met with a wave of bullets, one of which struck him in the head and killed him instantly. The following day, Meyer Frank also died in battle. Amos found himself in a tight situation. He could not arrest over 100 men. Everyone involved refused to testify against one another. He rode several times to the mine after hearing gunfire, but by the time he arrived, each party ceased fire and refused to leave. In the dark, he was unable to identify the culprits. Perhaps the most tricky of all, in an area and era that stood by miners who protected their claims by force, it was unclear which party was in the wrong. Amos published a card in the newspaper saying he needed to receive legal support from the government to begin making arrests. Finally, Governor David Ballard gave him the authority. The governor issued a proclamation and gave it to one of the toughest lawmen and later warden in Idaho, Deputy U.S. Marshal Orlando Rube Robbins. Rube rode the entire journey from Boise to Silver City in 6 hours. The governor ordered soldiers at Fort Boise to ride out and support the local law enforcement, but they did not arrive for another 6 days. By then, it would all already be over. Rube could not wait for the reinforcements. The time to act was now. Amos saddled up, and he and Rube rode the rest of the way to the mine. Once there, Rube read the proclamation to the miners.
I, D.W. Ballard, Governor of the Territory of Idaho, do this day issue my proclamation commanding all armed parties in said county to disperse peacefully to their homes without delay.
Each group submitted, and by 2 the next day, the company's lawyers had agreed on a compromise dividing the earth between the two mines. Once the miners had taken down the fortifications and put away their guns, they went back to work immediately. John R. McBride, who investigated the situation on behalf of the governor, reported back, quote,
On one level, there was a heavy timber used as a support for the roof, probably 15 inches in diameter. It was filled with bullets and had been so frequently struck and pierced that at one place about 2 or 3 feet from the floor, it was cut nearly in two. It was said that this one piece of timber had been struck by 2,000 bullets.
Oh my gosh.
After 18 days of fighting, there were multiple gunshot wounds, several amputations, and 2 dead men. But the dark protected the vast majority of the participants and prevented higher bloodshed. Despite the truce, the fight was not over yet. Naturally, with the illusion of peace after 18 days of intense fighting, many of the men involved went out to celebrate the night of April 1st. Few were so relieved to have the whole ordeal over with than John Marin Moore, one of the co-owners of the Ida Elmore mine. He drank heavily that night in celebration. Moore, accompanied by Jack Fisher and Ben White, made their way down the road, but as they passed the Idaho Hotel, they ran into Sam Lockhart, a supporter of the Golden Chariot mine. How the fight started is unknown, but Moore lifted his cane to hit Lockhart. Lockhart leapt back, pulled his pistol, and shot Moore through the chest. Fisher and White's guns flashed out. Fisher shot a bolt through Lockhart's arm, and White's gun misfired. In response, Lockhart put a bolt into Fisher's thigh before retreating back into the hotel. Lockhart ran upstairs, clutching his mangled, bleeding arm. He found Hilbecky, the owner of the Golden Chariot, knowing his boss would defend him. Outside of the hotel, the situation looked grim. They rushed Moore to the Oriental restaurant. Doctors arrived, but the wound proved to be too grievous. Moore managed to get out.
They have stolen the mine. Now their man Lockhart has killed me.
He died in 3 hours. The Ida Elmore faction viewed Lockhart as a hired gun who shot down their unarmed leader in the street. This murder sent the camp into a frenzy, loading guns and forming a mob to overtake the killer. Back in the hotel, Hill knew the stakes but found himself far too loyal to give up his employee and friend to an angry mob. Hill and 2 of his men quickly loaded their rifles and prepared for a showdown. He stood at the top of the stairs and yelled for everyone to hear,
"The man who comes to take Lockhart out of this hotel without a warrant will die before he reaches the head of the stairs."
But Hill and his men were vastly outnumbered and completely surrounded. Outside, the mob began to chant,
"Bring him out! Bring him out! Bring him out! Hang him! Hang him! Hang him! Hang him!"
100 men gathered and were ready to tear down the hotel if needed to get to Lockhart. Sheriff Amos would have none of it. He and his deputies pushed through the crowd and into the hotel. Amos sent his deputies running down each hall, stationing themselves every door and window. Then he turned back to face the crowd, 100 men, and told them,
"If you attempt this foolish act, every man that makes the attempt will be killed."
Any of those who had called Amos a coward for not intervening in the war at the beginning now had to watch in silence as the mob dispersed, utterly unwilling to take on Amos and just a few deputies. Within this act, the war finally came to a close. By the time the 95 U.S. troops arrived the following week, they found their efforts were too little too late. The war was over. The doctors found Lockhart's arm in bad shape and were forced to amputate it. But blood poisoning and gangrene had already set in, and Lockhart died on July 13th. He died as the final victim of the war on the mountain, but with the satisfaction that he'd been saved from being hanged by a violent mob. The Owyhee Avalanche, along with the other newspapers, struggled to keep up with these events as they unfolded, so it's no surprise the names of the deputies involved were never listed. But Johnny had been working for his brother as a deputy for over 2 years and was undoubtedly involved. He likely rode with Amos and Rube to the mines to read the governor's declaration. He also must have stood by the door or window in the Idaho hotel with a rifle in his hand as his brother faced down the mob. Johnny had great admiration for Amos, and as a loyal brother, I'm sure he never hesitated to back his brother, even in a dangerous situation. But if the 22-year-old's hands shook as he held his gun, waiting to see what happened, I would not blame him. hard to even imagine what type of stress the law enforcers were under during those years in Silver City. But the group still managed to find time to pull pranks on one another. Johnny, along with Bart and William Mays, hung an effigy by the neck outside of the courthouse. They then called the district attorney to come see the warning which had been left for them by the vigilante committee, who were displeased with the actions of the officers and the district attorney. The attorney, after seeing the dummy, vowed to protect the officers and fight off anyone who came after them. He then removed a knife and proceeded to prance back and forth, slashing through the air. Johnny and the Mays brothers fought back laughter as the attorney's heroic display, reassured by the demonstration. The group definitely had fun at each other's expense, but it would not all be jokes and laughs for Amos and Johnny. Their younger brother, Albert, followed their example and headed out west. Albert was in fact just 2 years younger than Johnny and his closest sibling in age. Whether he intended to meet up with his brothers in Silver City or not is unclear. Either way, he never made it. On August 3rd, 1869, Albert entered the Grecian Bend Dance Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada. Albert sat, had a few drinks, and began to talk to Grace Kearson, an employee of the establishment. What might have started as flirting turned into fighting as the pair began to argue. Bartender Bob Deadman removed his gun, ran to Grace's aid, and slammed the butt of his pistol into Albert's head, and then hit him 6 more times. Albert began to bleed profusely before collapsing to the ground. Bystanders took Albert to the Collins house and sent for Dr. Green. The doctor decided Albert needed emergency brain surgery, so he cut open his head and removed 11 bone fragments from his brain.
Oh boy.
Albert held on to life for 3 more days before passing away.
Pre-hand washing, yes?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Ouch.
The state of Nevada found Bob Deadman guilty of murder in the second degree and acquitted Grace Kearson of all charges. 2 years later, Nevada State Prison saw one of its most violent riots in its history, and Lieutenant Governor Devner with his family were caught in the crossfire. The lieutenant governor and his wife, daughter, along with 5 other citizens were trapped in one of the buildings being ransacked. Prisoner Bob Deadman stood in the door to protect the family and fought off other prisoners who tried to storm their room. With nothing but a chair, Deadman fought off prisoners armed with shanks and guns until military troops arrived to save the lieutenant governor's family. The family credited him for saving their lives and the lives of their children, saying,
"Bob fought them like a tiger."
For this incredible show of bravery, Deadman received a pardon the same year. Despite the lives he saved, the man he killed before prison remained dead. It's unclear how Amos and Johnny took the news of their brother's death, but it surely affected them both greatly. Their baby brother now lay 6 feet under. His final act? Fighting with a sex worker. His death caused by buffaloing. The term buffaloing is used to describe someone hitting a gun against another person's head. This was done to subdue an individual without shooting them. Many law enforcers of the West, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson being prime examples, use this to enforce the law. Even if this often was used as a non-lethal way to knock someone out, there was always a risk of killing them. His brother's death in Nevada is likely why John never used this to enforce the law. After the war on the mountain, Amos had had enough. Once his term as sheriff ended, he turned in his badge, which was then given to William Stevenson, the new sheriff. Amos left law enforcement forever. He married Millie Grant in 1869 and opened a livery, housing and feeding horses with enough style for the Avalanche to refer to it as a horse restaurant. The mines in the region were booming. Despite the interruption caused by the war on the mountain, the Golden Chariot Mine produced $200,000 worth of profit, and the Ida Elmore produced $600,000. In 1868 alone, that's $17 million in today's currency.
Wow.
All in just 1 year.
That's insane.
While the profits quickly rebounded, the men who had fought in the conflict faced a harder road to recovery. Superstitions were common among miners due to the high risks of the job, but many of those who returned to work after the conflict noticed a change in the mines. The ground that had been soaked with blood and filled with spent bullets littering the shafts no longer felt the same. Still, most miners shook off the feeling and continued working. There was too much money at stake, and those who did not work did not get paid. Nervousness in the dark shafts wasn't enough reason to quit. On November 19, 1870, the Owyhee Avalanche published an account from one of the miners. After a long day of work, the miner found himself alone in the deserted chambers of the mine. Gathering his gear, he picked up his lantern and started to make his way out. As he walked through the shaft leading to the boundary line between the two claims that had caused so much bloodshed, he turned to the corner and saw John Holgate standing alone in the darkness. John stood there, with the bolt wound in his head. His ghostly lips moved as if speaking, but the specter made not a sound. John used his thin, bony hand to beckon to the worker to come closer. Come closer. But the worker did not approach. Instead, he fled as fast as he could. It seemed even in death, the Golden Chariot mine still belonged to John Holgate. The miner is not the only one to claim to have seen the phantom of John Holgate. Quote, others are said to have seen the same apparition and aver that it is either Holgate or his ghost. Some people believe that such a violent end would naturally cause a spirit to linger. Others might suggest that the sightings were due to post-traumatic stress. Whether you see this story as a real supernatural phenomenon or just the result of untreated trauma, it's clear that after extreme violence, ghosts can come in many forms. While his brother worked at the livery, Johnny continued his role in law enforcement as a deputy. With a friendly and kind disposition, he quickly made friends with the many in the community, including Jack Stoddard, John Posley, and Frank Blackinger. The group often embarked on hunting trips together, exploring the open, rolling hills of Cow Creek. At 16, Frank was 9 years younger than Johnny, and one can't help but wonder if Johnny's friendship with the boy was influenced by the recent loss of his own little brother, Albert. The Blackinger family was well established in the new Idaho Territory. Frank's parents, Valentine and Marguerite, were both born in Germany and immigrated to the United States in 1839. They crossed the plains in a covered wagon to Oregon before eventually settling in Owyhee in 1863. Valentine found great success operating the War Eagle Hotel, and soon the family became known as, quote, one of the most respected families of Idaho. Together, Marguerite and Valentine had 10 children. While Frank and Johnny might have begun a long friendship, it was Frank's older sister who truly captured Johnny's eye. Louisa Elizabeth Blackinger, born in 1854 Buffalo, New York, is the third child in the family, crossed the plains at the age 8. First to Oregon, then to the wild country of Idaho. With her strong brown eyes, soft features, and long curly dark hair, Johnny wasn't the only one to notice as this pioneer girl blossomed into an elegant Victorian woman. The Owyhee Outpost described her as, quote, one of the most attractive girls in town. Valentine's expanding business led the family to purchase the Central Hotel in Boise, which promoted them to make regular trips to the city. In June 1871, Johnny and Louisa's names first appeared together in the newspaper when the pair was reported missing. Fortunately, it was a false alarm. The Owyhee Avalanche reported John Catalow, John Springer, and Miss Mary and Louisa Blackinger were advertised as being lost, strayed, stolen, or eloped. We now take pleasure in stating that the ladies and gentlemen referred to have, after the manner of the prodigal son, returned to Silver City intact. They are well pleased with the capital and its people, but still think
there is no place like home.
And with that, the courtship began. Silver City was large for a mining town, but not so large that members of the community weren't aware of one another. It's likely more than one person noticed Johnny's feelings for Louisa. On February 3rd, 1872, the Avalanche teased Johnny, another local bachelor, saying, if anyone in Silver City ought to marry, then listed 4 men, one of whom was Johnny Springer. It went on to say, they've broken hearts enough with their handsome faces and killing ways and should not be permitted to do any more damage to married women. Some strong-minded female should seal herself to each one of these boys and keep them in nights. That summer, on July 11th, 1872, a party of 11 left Silver City to go on a hunt. Louisa and her older sister Mary were 2 of the 6 women in the group. Hosea Eastman and his sister Emma were also in attendance. Eastman, a prominent businessman in Silver City, owned the Idaho Hotel, a direct competitor with Valentine Blackinger's hotel. Despite this rivalry, Eastman was actively courting Valentine's daughter Mary, a hotel Romeo and Juliet, if you will. Of course, Johnny, likely encouraged by Louisa's presence, joined the entourage. In a rare moment of historical documentation, we have a diary entry left behind by one of the young women in attendance, giving us a unique insight into the trip. Here's how she described the adventure.
I assure you, the good nature and hilarity of the gentlemen, the sprightliness and rosy cheeks of the ladies, fanned by the delightful morning breeze, announced to the eye, the ear, the senses, the fancy, and the heart that they were all glad to get away from the dry and dusty town.
The group, along with their trusty dogs, Sport and Joe, rode their horses down to the northern branch of Cow Creek, 15 miles east of Silver City. After eating lunch, 2 of the men went off to hunt, the dogs explored the rocks around the creek, and the rest of the party stayed behind to fish.
After fishing about an hour, we all took a bath. That is, we took off our shoes and stockings and waded and splashed around in the limpid waters of the stream as we were wont to do in childhood days. But our sport was suddenly brought to an end by a fish seizing one of the ladies by her big toe and dragging her under the water, clothes and all, at least so she avers. Such screaming and scampering as we ladies made you can well imagine. But the unfortunate was at length rescued from her might-have-been watery grave. And as we had no duplicate clothing along with us, she was hung out on the willows to dry.
What? Is this a sturgeon, or is this a...
Or a prank. Them teasing each other, oh, something's got me. That's what I'm imagining when I'm hearing this.
Wow.
Victorians were just weird, right? Like, they were just weirdos.
At 7 that night, they ate a dinner of fish and the game they caught that day. For dessert, they enjoyed ale. As the sun began to set, they settled down for the night.
Blankets were spread on the grassy carpet under a canopy of the softest blue, mellowed by the last rays of the setting sun. Twilight comes on apace, the gentlemen light their fragrant Havanas, and we all gather around the campfire which flickers in the center of the group. The story circulates and songs are sung, the adventures of the day are recounted, and if they receive something of the coloring of romance, it may be traced to feelings that grow out of the occasion. The night owl hoots and the prairie wolves howl in the distance.
The diary is simply signed,
Yours truly, one of the ladies.
This is one of my favorite historical documents I've ever been given access to. It's rare to learn anything about a couple's courtship from this time period, let alone be given such fascinating details of a group date during 1872. Later that year, Eastman proposed and Mary accepted. That fall, Louisa's sister, Mary Blackinger, married Eastman. Outside of courting Louisa, Johnny began to participate in prize fighting. During a unique period in boxing history, bare-knuckled fighting, which had originated in 1600s, was transitioning to a more modern sport. Fighters had begun to use leather gloves called mufflers, which would have later evolved into boxing gloves we know today. However, the sport remained largely unregulated. That changed in 1867, the year after Johnny arrived in Silver City. With the introduction of the Queensberry rules, these rules established formal regulations and equipment standards which gradually shaped the sport of boxing. Even so, it took time for these practices to become fully adopted in America, where many states outlawed the sport altogether. Idaho, however, was not one of them. Prize fights were popular entertainment in mining towns, offering opportunities for gambling and for miners and cowboys to prove their grit with their fists. Idaho City even hosted sparring exhibitions as early as 1864. It's unclear how much time Johnny spent boxing, but years later he casually admitted to being a fighter.
I myself have used boxing gloves and believe there is no better exercise.
By then, however, boxing had fallen out of favor, the Idaho statesman describing it as human bulldog contesting. This suggests John may have downplayed his involvement in the sport. I expect he had more experience as a young man than he let on.
people boxed a lot of times, especially in the South, for like honor. Like it wasn't just like violence just to be violent.
Yeah.
And then the working class becomes a really cheap form of entertainment for urban populations, especially men, not even especially, almost exclusively men, kind of starts to really fall out of favor as a legitimate sport and is seen instead as this like low class amusement.
Totally.
And so then eventually it makes its way back into the mainstream in like the 10s and 20s. But I wonder how much of this, him downplaying it, has to do with that sort of lower class image that it got.
Can't agree with you more, Skye. I think that's one of the ways we see the sport change. And for these blue-collar men, you know, $10,000 for a fight, if they're desperate, like, who wouldn't want a payday like that? Outside of boxing, hunting, and courting Louisa, Johnny's deputies as a lawman still always came first. In 1875, 2 men managed to escape from jail by tunneling under the courthouse and making a swift getaway. Sheriff Hayes quickly ordered Deputy Johnny Springer to bring him back. With Tim Sia by his side, Johnny saddled up and rode hard in pursuit. His exceptional tracking skills led them to Goose Creek Mountains, where the escaped men were finally apprehended. Johnny's prowess as a tracker continued to speak for itself. After a horse and mule were stolen, Johnny, who had just earned the position of undersheriff, along with his close friend Jack Stoddard, they set out on Saturday night, riding all throughout the night on the dark mountain roads. By Sunday morning, they were closing in on the horse thieves. The culprits, sensing their pursuers were near, abandoned their stolen horses near Denier's Ferry and attempted to swim across the Owyhee River to freedom. However, Johnny and Jack waded into the river and through the thick brush on the island, where they successfully arrested the wanted men. On January 29, 1876, Mance Eastman, Charlie Hayes, Milt Polk, and Johnny were enjoying a game of chess and cigars by the fire in the Idaho Hotel. They noticed across the street that the new preacher, Reverend W.G. Simpson, had just received a large order of wood. This tenderfoot didn't seem to know where to begin in cutting it up. Mance, taking pity on the preacher, remarked,
"I should like to saw that wood up for the preacher."
Johnny, who had strong opinions about organized religion, but always ready to lend a helping hand, replied,
"Let's do it."
The 4 men, eager to help and perhaps a bit competitive, put money down to see which pair could chop the most wood in the shortest time. However, when they arrived, they quickly realized just how little progress the preacher had made. What began as a small wager turned into an all-day affair, with each man's bet compelling them to stay to the very end.
That sounds like something like I would find myself.
Yeah.
That would be a way my parents would get me and my brothers to do a chore. Like, all right, whoever can do this fastest, oh man. And then at the end of the day, they win. And we're the sorry people.
I could totally see you with your friends, Anthony, smoking a cigar and like seeing a good deed and like rushing to do it. Your friend group specifically.
Are you guys smoking a lot of cigars, Anthony?
Every day. No.
You are such a cigar smoker.
I do smoke a lot of cigars.
Although the exact date is unknown, it was clear that at some point the newspapers stopped referring to the undersheriff as Johnny. One day he simply became John. John continued to show affection towards Louisa, but they took their time with their romance. This slow pace may have been influenced by John's financial standing. The Blackingers were one of the most prominent families in the area. Louisa's sister Mary had married Eastman, who, although running a competing hotel, shared a similar social class as the Blackinger family. How would a transient boy from Maine compare to the aristocrats of Silver City? But the undersheriff's fortunes were changing. In 1874, Jack Stoddard discovered a deposit of gold while working as a cook in a lumber yard. He kept the discovery a secret and returned the following year with John, Tim Reagan, and Charlie Hayes. These men had struck it rich. Their discovery of the Delmore mine proved to be one of the greatest in the area, while its production bringing in an average of $1 million per year. Well, he only owned a share of this mine and never gained the wealth of his brother-in-law Eastman. This greater financial stability and his stellar reputation in the community, John finally gained whatever approval he needed from Louisa's parents. He asked Louisa to marry him, and she agreed. On September 2nd, 1877, the 31-year-old John married the 23-year-old Louisa. While John and other miners prospered during this era, others experienced violence and suffering. As mentioned earlier, the establishment of these mining camps displaced the Shoshone, Bannock, Paiutes, and other native groups in Idaho. Defending their homelands and fighting for resources, these groups engaged in conflicts with the arrival of new immigrants. In 1863, Colonel Patrick Connor led the 2nd Regiment of California Volunteers in an attack on a Shoshone village, resulting in the deaths of around 400 men, women, and children in what is now known as the Bear River Massacre. 5 years later, the Shoshone signed the Treaty of Fort Bridgers and were confined to the Fort Hall Reservation. The following year, President Grant also relocated the Bannock Nation to the reservation. Although the Bannock and Shoshone were traditionally allies, the reservation was not large enough to support the 1,200 individuals now living on it, leading to widespread starvation. Conditions only worsened over the next decade as promised provisions from the government failed to reach the reservation. While homesteaders violated the treaty by destroying the Camas Prairie, Chief Buffalo Horn decided to risk war rather than watch his people starve. He and his people fled the reservation in May 1878, traveling west and engaging in skirmishes with homesteaders as they crossed the Idaho Territory. On June 8th, a group of 26 volunteers engaged in battle with the Bannock Nation on South Mountain near Silver City. Chief Buffalo Horn was fatally wounded during the battle and soon died. This did not end the conflict, as Chief Egan took over leadership of the fleeing group. However, by August, the United States had finally subdued the group. I've not found John Springer's name among the 26 men from Silver City who fought against the Bannock that summer, nor have I found anything to suggest that he participated in the war. However, this was major news in the United States at the time, and the Springers were likely well aware of the violence, even if they did not participate in it. It's possible that John's lack of involvement in the conflict was due to the fact that he was in Boise at the time of the war. The city of Boise, now nearing 20,000 residents. On the east side of the city lay the Idaho Territorial Penitentiary, established 6 years prior in 1872. As a federal institution, the United States Marshal oversaw the prison and was considered the primary warden. However, due to the many obligations the Marshal needed to fulfill, they often appointed a warden to act on their behalf. At the beginning of the year, U.S. Marshal Joseph Pinkham appointed Deputy Marshal Orlando Rube to replace Fred Arnold as warden of the penitentiary. By April, however, Rube resigned, but stayed plenty busy that year as he and Pinkham both went on to play active roles in the Bannock War. That summer, Joseph Pinkham executed Tom Biago, a warrior from the Bannock Nation who had killed a homesteader prior to the war at the Idaho Penitentiary. On June 28th, 250 people stood for hours in pouring rain to witness the only public execution in the history of the prison. Later that year, Pinkham's term as marshal expired. President Rutherford Hayes appointed E.S. Chase to replace him. Marshal Chase, of course, needed someone to oversee the penitentiary on his behalf, until he could find a more permanent warden. Chase could have asked a deputy marshal, as Pinkham did, or even a county sheriff. Chase did neither of those things, and instead appointed a deputy sheriff from Silver City named John Springer as warden of the penitentiary. The Idaho Penitentiary, only 6 years old, was both brand new and very small. It contained one cell house which held 42 cells, but only 19 prisoners. Around the prison there was a wooden fence, and men were still required to use a ball or chain or organ boot. John held this position for less than a year before returning back to Silver City. Despite this temporary appointment to the role, I think the fact that Marshal Chase thought of John for the position speaks to how highly others regarded John as a lawman, even while he was still working as a deputy. Back in Silver City, John continued his work as a lawman, earning a unique reputation as a deputy sheriff who did not use a gun. In an era of gunslingers, desperados, and outlaws, nearly every law enforcer was armed to the teeth. But John chose to go unarmed. Instead of drawing a weapon on those he needed to arrest, he simply talked to them. In the most dangerous situations, when individuals refused to comply, John occasionally resorted to his fists. However, it rarely came to that. As unconventional as this might sound, these methods of law enforcement proved to be highly effective. Jack Stoddard shared the following remarkable story about his friend. One day, a gunslinger arrived in town, wanted in California for the murder of several men. He arrived with his pistols displayed prominently on his waist. The gunman entered his saloon and ordered a drink. John, recognizing him from wanted posters, followed him in. The man spotted the lawman, and in a flash of silver, his gun was drawn and pointed at John. But John never broke stride and continued walking towards the gunslinger. As he approached, the gun began to quaver in the outlaw's hand. John looked him in the eye and said,
You don't dare pull the trigger. You don't dare shoot. You yella. Give me the gun.
The man, now shaking in his boots, did as he was told. He handed over his gun, and John escorted him to the jail to await transportation back to California.
What? Are there other examples of this in the Old West? Because
No, there really isn't. Tom Bear River Smith used fists instead of guns. He was famous as going unarmed. He was killed in the line of duty because someone came up to him with an axe to the back of his head. Anyway, no, there are very few examples of people trying to de-escalate without weapons. But as crazy as it sounds, the thing about everyone's armed, if you're the one man who's not armed and someone guns you down, they know they're going to, one, be gunned down by everyone around you, or two, get the death penalty.
Right.
Killing an unarmed law enforcer. And three, it was just an easy way to de-escalate. The second you reach for the gun, your opponent's going to draw. But if you don't have a gun, all of a sudden, you're the aggressor if you do anything else.
Yeah.
And if it is this, then it all the more speaks to his compassion and his ability to work with people and help them, that instead of immediately resorting to violence, he realized the situation is going to be better taken care of for everyone if we all stay calm. Mm-hmm. And I can get him to, respond to me in this way.
His law enforcing, like you said, Skye, to make sure not just that he's staying safe, but he's keeping the person safe that he's arresting. And that seems to be kind of a common theme with John throughout his career, is he really cared about the safety of those being arrested.
Yeah. I'm curious, you've kind of alluded to him never having religion and being kind of against religion throughout his life.
And so I don't see a lot of reports of it earlier in his career, but towards the end of his life, he started talking about it a lot.
For somebody to not have, a Christian faith at that time, and then to walk in unarmed without that as this underlying, I'm protected,
Yeah.
That's the part that wow, this guy was a interesting fellow, a monk.
Absolutely. Obviously, you don't need religion to have morals, but that's where a lot of people find morals. That's where they find their own code of ethics, and especially people who have unshakable codes of ethics. And John truly had an unshakable code of ethics, and it came just from his own morals. No religion behind it or anything like that. If nothing else, I feel like that's the most interesting thing.
Yeah, totally. Some real guts.
John, often photographed in dark suits with black ties, was already balding at this point in his life, but sported a full, dark beard. His strong jaw, prominent cheekbones, and piercing eyes gave him a commanding presence. In 1880, at the age of 34, John finally decided to run for sheriff of Owyhee County. Silver City, still feeling the lingering tensions of the Civil War, was often divided between Republican and Democratic parties. However, enough citizens were able to set aside partisan politics for John to win 245 votes to 188. The newspapers praised the victory, noting, "The fact that the people elected him over the strongest opponent that could be placed against him is evidence that he must have given satisfaction in the past." One might think that John's refusal to carry a gun would put him at a disadvantage in the election, but this was not the case. The Owyhee Avalanche explained why John garnered so much support. His integrity and honesty are beyond reproach. Without disparagement on anyone else, we may in this connection remark that he is the best police officer that Owyhee County ever had. Wherever official duty called him, he was there. A terror to lawbreakers, he was both feared and respected by them. Brave, active, unflinching under the most trying circumstances. Few dare detest the power of his arm. Whenever a row or a fight occurred, John Springer generally dropped in among the belligerent like a thunderbolt, and peace soon followed. Kind-hearted, accommodating, and sociable, He will be greatly missed here this winter. With his election victory, John knew his ability to leave the county for the next few years would be limited. So he decided to take advantage of the remaining months before being sworn in by doing a little bit of traveling. He escorted his wife to Boise to visit her family during his absence, and then John headed east. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad had revolutionized travel, making a trip that once took months a journey that could now be done in 2 weeks in relative comfort. John arrived back in Maine in time to surprise his family for the holidays.
On the feast of Stephen, when the snow lay round about.
Spent Thanksgiving Day with the old folks at home way down in Maine, and partook of a genuine New England dinner with my father and mother.
It had been 14 years since he had seen his parents.
Wow, that's so cool.
Trains are revolutionary, and they still are. Okay, I have to stop before I go on my rant about trains.
One can imagine the joy his parents must have felt at the return of their prodigal son for the holidays. John, too, must have felt an immense sense of gratitude for the opportunity to see his family again and the warm welcome awaiting him. That gratitude likely grew with time, for as he bid his family farewell, he could not have known it, but this would be the last time he would ever see his father alive again. John arrived back in Silver City on New Year's, ready to welcome both the new year and his new deputies as sheriff, as one paper put it, with his accustomed vim and vigor. Little did he know how difficult the year ahead would be. 1881 began with intense storms, bringing heavy snowfall to the mountains. John and Louisa were in the process of moving to another house, a lucky decision as their old home's roof collapsed under the weight of the snow. Other buildings, including the Minier stable and Obdolfer's warehouse, also buckled beneath the intense snowfall. On January 11th, Louisa and her mother, Margaret Blackinger, left Boise and headed towards Silver City. But whatever calm the day had held quickly gave way, and the storm returned with a vengeance. Meanwhile, John waited, worried, and watched the snowfall. The stage carrying Louisa and Margaret never arrived. The next morning, John found the roads now impassable, and his wife still missing. With a brief break in the blizzard, John knew he needed to act swiftly and wisely. Anthony, Skye, if you were trapped in a mining town and you knew your significant other and their mother were out there somewhere in the snowy mountain, what would you do?
I would try to find them.
But where do you even start?
Yeah.
You would go get your snowshoes. And that's exactly what John Springer did.
Yeah.
He gathered his emergency gear, donned his warmest coat, and strapped on his snowshoes and headed out into the white oblivion. Breaking through the fresh snow and making incredible time, the journey still proved challenging. But by that afternoon, John reached the homestead of Charlie Johnson, located along the state route. Stopping in to gather provisions, he was greatly relieved to find Louisa and Margaret warming themselves by the fire. The reunion must have been joyous, and the group spent the night by the warm hearth as the storm still howled outside. The following day, they decided to attempt the 12-mile trek up the mountain back to Silver City. James Griffin, the stage company agent, who was also snowed in, handed over the mail to John and wished the trio luck.
Wow.
Late that day, Silver City was astonished when the sheriff returned, pulling behind him a sled fashioned from his snowshoes. On top of the makeshift sled, bundled in furs, rode Louisa and Margaret. They arrived just in time as yet another storm began to bear down on the town. But this time, John and Louisa enjoy the snow from the comfort of the indoors, safe behind a frosted window pane. The day of their return, January 15th, also just so happened to be Louisa's 27th birthday. Despite the snow piling up as high as the rooftops, the city still held a dance that weekend. It's not documented whether Louisa and John were in attendance. February, new county laws regarding the punishment of opium use led to raids on the Chinese section of town. In 1870, Chinese individuals made up 30% of Idaho's population, but by 1880, those numbers had dwindled to just 4%. This sharp decline was due to widespread discrimination and violence directed at Chinese communities by Anglo immigrants. However, many mining towns, including Silver City, still maintained sizable Chinese populations. Opium, a dangerous and addictive drug, was heavily policed, but the laws targeting its use and distribution were often motivated by racial bias designated to disproportionately affect Chinese community members. Under Sheriff Mark Leonard led these raids, during which he and his men arrested 10 miners and confiscated a significant amount of drugs and drug paraphernalia. In court, the evidence failed to hold up. William Dewey, a prominent mine owner, represented the miners' defense. His approach was notably relaxed. He even brought, quote, a bottle of brandy and glasses, also a box of cigars, giving the courtroom a free and easy appearance, the likes of which was probably never before witnessed. 2 of the men were found guilty and ordered to pay a $10 fine, while the other 8 were set free. Raids on Chinese communities throughout the West were common and often brutal. When a Chinese miner came to John Springer with a complaint that one of his officers, Constable Honan, had assaulted him during the raid, John took the matter seriously, issuing an arrest warrant charging Honan with assault. John took the unusual step of arresting one of his own men. However, in court, the miner was unable to convince the jury of the crime, and Honan was acquitted. Outside of work, John and Louisa purchased a new home just off Washington Street for $400, about $1,200 in modern currency. While the couple must have been grateful for their new home together, most of John's time still revolved around his duties as sheriff. On April 16th, John arrested Morris Butner for stealing a mule. Later that month, Robert Henderson charged his own son with assault with intent to commit murder after the young man had fired a pistol at him. In May, John apprehended Charlie Brunzer for stabbing Thomas Jones, a former Silver City sheriff, during a knife fight. Remarkably, the court acquitted Charles. On Friday, June 3rd, the Idaho Hotel remained as busy as ever. Many miners and cowboys congregated at the bar downstairs. Tim Warren took a drink at the bar when he saw George Palmer enter the saloon. Bad blood had simmered between the 2 men for some time. Warren went over to Palmer, grabbed him by the shoulder, and told him,
"Come up and take a drink."
To which Palmer replied,
"I never drink."
"Damn it, come have a drink."
Warren jerked Palmer by his shoulder. Palmer open palm slapped Warren across the face. Both men leapt back and drew their guns. Palmer's first shot skimmed Warren's chin, while Warren's shot missed. Palmer's next shot hit Warren in the hip. Panicked patrons of the bar began to flee. Sheriff John Springer pushed his way through the crowd. Warren's second shot missed. Palmer put another bullet into Warren's arm, then into his hand holding his gun, completely disabling the arm. Palmer aimed for the killing shot. John, now within striking distance, leapt onto Palmer with that bullet only grazing Warren's chest. In all, 8 shots were exchanged in a matter of seconds, and the firepower managed to empty what had moments before been a busy saloon, leaving just 3 men in the war zone. The Owyhee Outlook commented, "The sheriff was the only man who remained during the shooting, as all others escaped to the doors and elsewhere." John arrested Palmer, who had no injuries, and summoned the doctor for Warren, who took 5 bullets during the fight. The doctor, however, reported that none of the wounds seemed life-threatening. Remarkably, no bystanders were killed in the crossfire, and John managed not to get hit as he tried to intervene. Neither gunslinger received a prison term for this fight. Arresting rustlers and gunmen kept John busy, but these were the types of crimes he expected. No different than the troubles he had dealt with as a deputy. However, in May, John encountered a prison accused of a crime unlike anything he'd faced before. On May 27th, Sheriff John Springer received custody of prisoner Henry McDonald to be placed in the Silver City Jail under his supervision. John did not know it at the time that his and MacDonald's legacies would soon become permanently intertwined. Henry MacDonald was born in Scotland in 1853. After migrating to the United States, he headed out west, where he met English housekeeper named Emma. The pair married and had 1 son, Henry Jr. In 1879, Emma and Henry Jr. lived in Kelton, Utah. while MacDonald found work as a butcher and freighter, which kept him frequently on the road. Freighters were massive wagon trains led by a team of mules, pulling thousands of pounds of supplies to remote mountain towns that were still isolated from the Transcontinental Railroad. The 240-mile road from Kelton to Boise, established by John Haley, became essential for bringing goods to mining towns of western Idaho. MacDonald, very skilled as a teamster, showed a lot of promise in this field. The ambitious 27-year-old hoped to one day own a team of his own. MacDonald eventually found work for George Myers. Everyone on the road knew Myers, who wore a long white beard, drove a team of 8 mules, and often became combative when intoxicated. In 1880, MacDonald began to negotiate with Myers about purchasing his team for the price of $1,400, a sum of money MacDonald did not have. While moving the team south that September, George Myers and MacDonald stopped at Pilgrim Station. At the station, MacDonald bragged to Edward Guard that his employer had agreed to let him buy it after MacDonald paid a $500 as a down payment. Guard did not believe this claim and asked Myers before they left if he really sold the team to MacDonald. Myers told him,
"No, I have not."
On September 28th, all 8 mules, 2 wagons, and 1 horse pulled into the Salmon Falls station, driven by MacDonald. But Myers was nowhere to be seen. Those working at the station recognized Myers' team and commented on his absence. MacDonald assured them that Myers rode ahead to purchase extra mules. But at the station to follow, MacDonald changed his story, explaining George Myers' absence by saying he actually purchased the team from Myers. MacDonald finished the trek back to Utah alone. Days turned to weeks, and no one had yet to see Myers. MacDonald, ready for his next trip, loaded up the wagon and headed back to Idaho. During the subsequent trip, more and more people grew suspicious of the missing George Myers and MacDonald's ever-evolving story. One such friend, William Marlett of Boise, received a letter from Myers, the first communication from the old teamster since his disappearance. However, Marlett's unease only grew after he opened the letter. In the letter, Myers explained that he did in fact sell the team to MacDonald and request Marlett to give MacDonald a fine horse, which George Myers would later reimburse after his return from Portland, Oregon. However, the letter was riddled with misspellings and had not been written in Myers' handwriting. When MacDonald showed up looking for the horse promised in the letter, Marlett did send him on his way with the stallion, but also hand-delivered that letter to Sheriff Joe Oldham of Ada County. For the following month, the sheriff began to investigate MacDonald's claims, none of which could be substantiated. Several individuals received letters from George Myers, but were unable to reconnect with him when they wrote back to the cities where those letters had been supposedly written. MacDonald also could not produce a bill of sale. Finally, due to pressure from John Haley, Sheriff Oldham arrested MacDonald. Once in the Ada County jail, MacDonald stuck to his story. Myers sold him the team before leaving to Oregon to buy horses. But now he added a new detail. After they parted ways with Myers, Frank Kelton and Gus Glenn's robbed him at gunpoint. Gus Glenn ran a ferry and is the namesake of the city Glenn's Ferry. MacDonald explained that if anyone killed Myers, it must have been these highwaymen. The Ada County District Attorney, Thomas Callahan, found himself in a tricky situation. MacDonald clearly had Myers' team and no bill of sale, but without a body, they lacked evidence of a murder. Luckily for the attorney, MacDonald supplied the evidence himself. On the night of November 18th, MacDonald wrote a letter to his friend George Rogers, in which he included 3 fictitious letters he wanted to be sent back to him, signed by George Myers. MacDonald asked his friend to help send them in order to prove his innocence, saying,
"George, now do me this favour, for this letter does depend on my life, and I'll make it alright when I see you. George, do nae be afraid of the money. I'm going to sell a span of mules as soon as I can, and I'll send the money to my wife. But George, do not wait till I send the money. Go right away."
He followed this with the 3 letters from George Myers, indicating where and when he wanted them sent. He asked his friend to try and get the handwriting as close as possible.
Be sure and get the shipment card and see where he signs his name. Get as near as you can. And date the letter when you write, George. I've always been a friend of you. Now do me this favour. Yours truly, Henry MacDonald. I shall go to hell if you deny do this for me.
MacDonald's cellmate, William Glines, who was waiting to be tried for horse stealing, held the candle for MacDonald as he wrote the letters and offered to smuggle them out. Instead, he gave the letters over to the guard. On March 12, 1881, ranchers outside Salmon Falls discovered human remains. They did not find much: some clothing, a scattering of bones, and a clump of gray hair. These were the only things the coyotes and wolves had left behind. However, the clothing was recognized as belonging to George Myers. During the last 6 months, MacDonald showed absolutely no guilt, even after learning of the gruesome discovery. He continued to claim his innocence, but clearly, MacDonald was strategizing a few backup plans. Guards soon found him digging a tunnel under his cell. After learning his cellmate Glines had given the guards his letter, MacDonald attacked Glines. As guards pulled MacDonald off him, he yelled at Glines' actions would cause him
to swing from the first tree I came to.
On May 14th, MacDonald escaped, stealing a horse and a gun. He rode to Atlanta and then to Bonanza near Custer City. Governor John Neal offered $500 reward for MacDonald, dead or alive. Jerry Plum, the guard on duty when MacDonald escaped, tracked him down and arrested him in a cabin in the Sawtooth Mountains. After the court determined that the crime most likely took place in Owyhee, Sheriff Oldham turned custody of MacDonald over to Sheriff John Springer. The man brought to the sheriff stood 6 feet tall, weighing 175 pounds. MacDonald had dark brown hair and a mustache with striking dark eyes. On June 7th, the trial began. 23 witnesses were brought to the stand. The remains found at Salmon Falls were shown to the court. The handwriting experts compared George Myers' real letters to the fake ones MacDonald had been sending. To MacDonald's great surprise, even Gus Glenn arrived to defend himself against MacDonald's accusation. However, the most damning part of the trial was when MacDonald took the stand. He changed his story again, saying he had witnessed Myers' death, but it had been an accident. Myers fell under the wagon wheel while trying to discipline his dog. When asked why he lied about it, MacDonald claimed Len Lewis and Frank Helton, now described as two travelers as he met on the road, prevented him from talking about it, though later he changed the story again to say,
I believe it's usual when companies are traveling together and one of them gets killed, to let it go and say nothing about it.
Again, to MacDonald's surprise, the district attorney found Len Lewis, who testified.
What the defendant says about me is false, and he knows it. I've never heard of such a man as Frank Kellett. I never had a conversation with the defendant about the death of Myers. At no time, at no place.
MacDonald clearly never suspected Glenn and Lewis would show up and testify. However, the other men, Frank Kelton, remains a bit of a mystery. MacDonald accused him of many things at various points after the crime, but no one in all of Idaho had ever heard of the name before. As the trial went on, MacDonald's stories became more exaggerated and complicated, and even he struggled to keep the details straight. It took the jury only 65 minutes to read a verdict of guilty. Judge Prickett sentenced MacDonald
to gratify your avarice and possess yourself of the fruits of another's labor in the most cowardly manner, and without a moment's warning, you struck down and killed an estimable old man who had never harmed you, but had befriended you. You stand convicted of one of the most inexcusable and cold-blooded crimes ever committed in this territory, and the fate which has overtaken you is but the just deserts of your wicked act. The judgment of this court and the sentence of the law is that you be, by the sheriff of Owyhee County, hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God in his infinite goodness have mercy on your soul.
Henry MacDonald's days were now officially numbered. During the trial, MacDonald's wife Emma and his son Henry Jr. came to the city. Emma, distressed and impoverished, quickly gained the sympathy of Silver City. She had spent all of her savings just to reach her husband, whom she had not seen for almost a year. The women of the town rallied around her, donating new clothes for Emma and her child, gathering $133 to give her and arranging a free stagecoach ride back to Kelton. As John made preparations for the execution, he and his brother Amos received heartbreaking news. The captain was dead. Their father passed away 17 days prior. By the time the brothers received the letter, Captain Elijah Springer already rested 6 feet under. John did not have time to mourn. The sheriff, who'd spent his career refusing to carry a gun and doing everything in his power to avoid killing those who broke the law, now faced the grim reality of being ordered to execute a man. John oversaw the construction of the gallows next to Ruby City Cemetery, 1 mile south of Silver City. Newspapers were not sympathetic towards the condemned man, calling him the, quote, wolf on the trail. As his final day approached, MacDonald lost weight and grew a full beard. He still maintained his innocence, saying,
"The fact is, I've made so many different statements, trying to shield guilty parties. I've got the whole blame on myself."
On October 11th, 3 nights before the execution, it began to storm. A reporter for the Owyhee Avalanche stopped by the jail to see if they could get one final interview. Inside, they sat with Sheriff John Springer and MacDonald by a metal stove, which fought to keep the jail warm. Outside, the storm had turned to snow. During the interview, MacDonald finally confessed to the crime, kind of. MacDonald changed the story yet again, claiming that he, Lewis, and Frank Kelton murdered Myers together before robbing him.
"I'll take a solemn oath before God and man. I never struck Myers but once, and only with my fist."
That was the closest MacDonald ever came to admitting guilt, still insisting Lewis struck the final blow. He went on to say,
"I don't care for dying. I told you nothing but the truth, knowing I can't live. The only thing I regret is leaving my wife and child this way. And I hope the truth will be known sometime."
As the week progressed, the storm worsened. The snow began to pile up. Thomas B. Mary, a journalist for the Idaho Statesman, captured the atmosphere, writing,
"As the shadows of the night stole down over War Eagle Mountain, the frozen tears of heaven began to fall. It seemed as if God incensed at the stubbornness of the criminal in implicating others in a crime of which he was the sole proprietor. Over the crest of the bold mountain, now crowned with the tempest, came the bleak wind and the pitiless snow. It seemed that the fatal noose was almost needless. The chilling storm alone was enough to send the wretched creature out of the world."
When asked how he felt about the execution, John admitted,
"To think that I have to end the life of a man who, no matter what he did to others, never injured me. It is terrible."
On the morning of October 14th, John and Jack Stoddard waited with MacDonald. Together, they talked quietly around the stove and watched the clock. MacDonald reflected.
"I'm going to die for a crime today, for which other men should die as well as myself. On the 19th day of September, 1880, I was as free from crime as yourself. On the 20th, Len Lewis suggested to me that we should get away with the old man Myers, as he had lots of sugar. All I got for my participation in the crime was that team. I'm going to die for a deed, of which others got all the benefits. I didn't kill Myers, but I was party to the crime, and I helped to conceal him. Had I come out first, I could have saved my life. I let it go too long."
Catholic priest Father Natini arrived at the jail as the sounds of the gathering crowd echoed down the road. When the clock struck 1, Sheriff John Springer told MacDonald it was time. Together they stepped out of the jail. MacDonald's prison stripes were hidden by a heavy overcoat, with a yellow blanket draped around him to guard against the icy winds. His beard now long, he wore a black hat. With John on one side and Father Natine on the other, they exited the jail, 2 officers close behind. They climbed onto the wagon outside the jail and began the procession down the road. Next to the graveyard stood the gallows, completely surrounded. 300 community members had gathered to witness the grim procession. Upon seeing the gallows, MacDonald calmly asked,
"Are those hoisting works?"
They did, in fact, work. The district attorney sent word asking if he could speak to MacDonald.
"Tell the son of a bitch to go to hell."
John accompanied MacDonald up the stairs. MacDonald walked with a steady step. From the platform, MacDonald could see the plain pine coffin resting on the ground below, and 20 feet beyond that, his freshly dug grave. In a clear and firm tone, John read the death warrant. He then asked if MacDonald had anything to say. MacDonald shook his head. After moments of speaking constantly, he finally had nothing left to say. Several of MacDonald's friends shook his hands, along with the guards. Then Father Natini bid him farewell. MacDonald gave him a silent smile in return. His hat was removed, a black bag placed over his head, and the noose tightened around his neck. The clock struck 2. Sheriff John Springer took the lever in his hand and looked one last time at the man before him, and then pulled the lever.
I turned away my head and heard a dull thud as he flung into eternity. His neck was instantly broken by the fall, and barring a nervous twitch in his hands, his death was almost painless. He fell at 1 minute past 2 o'clock, and his life was pronounced extinct in 20 minutes.
Henry McDonald, the only execution to take place in Silver City, died on October 14th, 1881. The Idaho statesman mocked John, claiming, "If ever a conscientious officer shrank from a regular duty, that officer was Sheriff Springer." However, the historical record contradicts these accusations. John clearly had conflicting feelings about the execution, as he himself admitted, but when it came time to pull the lever, his grip remained firm, and he carried out the execution. If he hesitated, it was but for a moment before he fulfilled his duty. After the crowd dispersed, the coffin was buried, and John returned home. One wonders what that night might have been like for him. Perhaps John sat up and talked to Louisa, or maybe he didn't. Either way, as the October winds howled and snow blanketed the sleeping city, one thing is undeniable. It must have been one cold night in Silver City. Even with McDonald dead, the duties of the job continued. A Chinese miner got into a fight with Mr. E. Westgate, who claimed that the miner shot at him after he refused to give him a ride on his wagon. Once in jail, awaiting trial, the miner, whose name, like so many other Chinese immigrants, was not reported by newspapers, became very ill. John sent for the doctor, but the ailment went undiagnosed. The man grew sicker. John, convinced that the miner was going through opium withdrawals, took a confiscated pipe and prepared it. However, when he offered it to the man, he declined. On November 21st, the miner finally succumbed to the illness and died. The year of 1882 proved to be less trying for John than the previous, but much of the conflicts that awaited the sheriff remained the same. Discord stemming from brothels routinely made the newspapers. At one point, a man put a pig into one of the rooms of the so-called soiled doves. A mean-hearted prank, perhaps inspired by jealousy.
And by that, do you mean that one of the houses of ill repute?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Not all conflicts occurred between customers and sex workers. One article reported a fight between two women, stating, "A couple of frail sisters indulged in a hand-to-hand tussle on Washington Street, and for a time the air was filled with stripped hose, blue oaths, clean clothes, high-heeled slippers, and all the paraphernalia that goes to make up a woman. A couple of peacemakers of the opposite sex pulled the combatants apart, and they retired to their respective homes to repair the damage." In more serious situations, one of the employees of the red light district attempted suicide. She survived, but the risk of overdose, depression, and suicide remained high for the women working in these brothels. John arrested J.C. Johnson for threatening the life of George Gilmore. Another week, F. Woka, a local businessman, was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. A man named Roach and Atona Faber tried a quick-draw duel in a saloon. The men around them tried to intervene, and as Roach pulled out his gun, he shot himself in the groin, with the papers reporting his injury's location, saying, "If Roach had been a woman, the ball would have not touched him."
Oh, my.
That's part of the reason my wife does not want me to have a gun. Was it himself?
That was his own gun as he was pulling it out, and someone tried to stop him. Not all gunfights were fatal, but many were violent and pointless. These crimes kept John and the Hotel de Springer, as the town folks began to refer to the jail, quite busy. After the war on the mountain, paranoia plagued mine owners. Bill Hastings became convinced that William Baxter was a hired gun, paid to kill him and take his mine. Hastings decided to beat him to it. On the 25th of September, William Baxter left the Idaho Hotel and headed to the Morning Star mine. At the entrance of the mine, he was greeted by W. Townsend, and the men started a conversation as Townsend gathered his picks and shovels. Bill Hastings, rifle ready, came around the mine, and when he saw the two men, he called out,
"Are you working men or fighting men?"
Townsend tried to reassure Hastings,
"We're working men. Don't shoot, Bill."
"You are here, you son of a bitch. Get off."
Hastings pulled his rifle to his shoulder and fired into Baxter. He came closer to the victim and muttered,
"If he is not dead, I will shoot him again."
"What did you do that for?"
"I meant to do it. Look at this pistol.
Hastings opened up Baxter's coat to reveal a Colt.
I could kill you if I wanted to, but I do not want to. You can carry the carcass off.
Hastings rode into town where he turned himself in to Deputy Hunt. He was placed without bail to await his trial, but the date never came. He too died in jail for undisclosed reasons, but not before he said his goodbyes to his mother. That November, John won the election for sheriff again. This time, he won by an astounding 856 votes. Whatever he was doing as a lawman, the people of Owyhee liked it, but the job seemed to be taking a serious toll on him. The challenges of the mountain town were not just weighing heavy on John. Father Natini, who performed the final rites on MacDonald the previous year, also bid farewell and left the community. John and Louisa were unable to make it to Maine for the holidays, but they went to Boise and spent Christmas with her parents. In 1883, the Spring Fights, as the paper referred to it, kick-started with Jack McGee shooting a 19-year-old boy in the arm. Despite this, 83 turned out to be the quietest year of John's career. While the types of crimes remained similar, there seemed to be far fewer of them than the years before. John suffered from bad health for most of the year, though the cause was never specified. On October 13th, 1883, he announced his resignation as sheriff of Owyhee County. His deputy, Mark Leonard, was unanimously appointed to fill his vacancy until the next election, which Leonard won. John bought a ranch and began raising sheep. While officially retired from law enforcement, he still pitched in to help transport prisoners to the Idaho Penitentiary and work on the fire crew. But for the most part, he no longer had to deal with the problems of the city. In 1884, our bourbon-sharing lawyer William Dewey engaged in a gunfight and was sentenced to the penitentiary. Check out Stool Pigeon Season 7 to hear the fantastic Tristan Hafer tell that story in its entirety. In April of the same year, the jail held two prisoners, Fred Woodworth and Amu. After Fred set the building on fire, Deputy Jack Stoddard and Sheriff Leonard were unable to put it out and rescue the men. Both prisoners burned to death. Life as a shepherd seemed to suit Springer well, and having a more open schedule allowed them to travel more frequently to California and Boise to visit Louisa's parents. In 1889, John bought 2,600 sheep to add to his herd. On May 13th, the flock grew yet again when Louisa gave birth to a baby girl who they named Alice, after John's mother. With everything going so well in a couple's life, it's hard to imagine they would want anything to change. But John was once again called for duty one final time. 1889 was not just an important year for the Springer family, but for the territory of Idaho, which found itself in a pivotal moment in its history, because the United States was considering it for statehood. Statehood, however, required law and order, and the heart of law and order in the Old West was the penitentiary. In August of that year, Marshal J.P. Wilson called upon John Springer to stand in as warden. This never seemed to be a permanent arrangement, nor do I suspect John wanted a permanent position. The marshal just needed someone to oversee the prison while they found a replacement for Ezra Baird. John agreed and took over command of the prison. The site at this point faced serious overcrowding in its one cell house, and construction on a second building was almost complete. The prison still used a wooden fence, and those incarcerated were required to use a ball and chain or an organ boot every time they left the cell house. Because of this, and for security reasons, most prisoners were confined inside their cells for the majority of the day. While many individuals were serving for petty crimes, the overcrowding was due in large part to the crackdown on Mormon polygamy, incarcerating those who practiced what was considered unlawful cohabitations. But there were still a few significant prisoners that year, including William Teton Jackson, the Prince of Horse Thieves, featured on episode 87, the notorious and dangerous Samuel Hatton, Stool Pigeon Season 6, Frank Barnes, the whip maker to Her Majesty, episode 42, and Edward Trafton, the laughing bandit of Yellowstone, who we will talk about at the end of this season. A reporter for the Idaho Statesman toured the prison with Warden Springer unavailable. Deputy Warden Ras Beamer gave the tour, and the reporter remarked that the facility was in ship-shape condition, saying,
"The grounds inside the stockade, with the exception of that in the immediate vicinity of the new building, which at this time is covered with lumber, etc., are as clean as one could wish. One thing noted in particular was the neat flower garden in front of the warden's office, which shows up in great contrast to the grim stone walls, the crowd of prisoners, and the watchful sentries pacing to and fro on the walls."
John Stay's warden was short, and by the end of 1891, John Wilson took over the position, and John Springer went back to his wife, daughter, and all of his many sheep. In 1891, a prison investigation sparked the largest scandal of John Springer's career. The public was horrified to learn boxing matches had occurred within the prison. While rumors of guards drinking and gambling during these fights were proven false, witnesses confirmed that prisoners Wesley Dunlap, William McCree, and John Brathwaite had engaged in pugilism matches. Warden W.S. Mack defended the bouts, claiming the previous wardens, including John Springer, had allowed prisoners to box. Having spent most of his life in Silver City, a town with regular prize fights, John likely attended these events and participated. Not a huge surprise given his own confidence with his fist. After all, a sheriff who leaves his gun at home in one of Idaho's most dangerous cities likely felt pretty confident with his own right hook. During a time when prison work and exercise opportunities were limited, boxing might have been seen as a way to keep prisoners entertained, active, and encourage good behavior. During the trial, John defended his actions by saying,
"I allowed the prisoners to make a set of gloves out of a pair of buckskin pants. They stuffed them with wool. They were used frequently, perhaps every day. They seemed to enjoy the exercise. I myself have used boxing gloves and believe there is no better exercise. On the 1st of August, 1889, I again took charge of the prison. They then had boxing gloves there, and I continued to permit their use while I was there. In the absence of a fixed daily routine of labor, in my opinion, it is absolutely necessary for the health of the convicts that they should have athletic sports of that kind. I have indulged in it myself and have also encouraged running, foot races, and walking for the same reasons."
Nice.
However, what may have been acceptable in the rough mining town of Silver City did not sit well in a more refined community of Boise. The investigation into the boxing scandal revealed something much more damaging for Mack. Auditors discovered $400 missing from the penitentiary funds. The state asked Warden Mack to resign before March 12th. Governor Norman Wiley then faced the task of reappointing a new warden. He recommended reappointing John Springer. However, Joseph Pinkham, a former U.S. Marshal and warden, found this suggestion outrageous, stating,
"How can anyone condemn and reprimand the current warden for permitting boxing in the prison and then recommend John R. Springer, who did everything in his power to encourage the same offense when he was warden?"
He has a point. Needless to say, John did not get reappointed as warden. In fact, this likely ended his career in law enforcement. John became interested in another appointment as sheriff, but this time in Boise in 1894. He received substantial support, winning the Republican nomination over Orlando Rube. The Delmore Nugget expressed their support, stating, "Mr. Springer was, for one term, sheriff of Owyhee, and although several excellent officers have since held the position, it is not unusual to hear him still spoken of as the best sheriff Owyhee County ever had. The Ada County people will find they have made no mistake if they elect him. He will prove honest, impartial, energetic, and efficient." Despite such incredible praise, the residents of Boise were not convinced, and John lost the election. However, while he may have not won the popular vote, his previous career impressed many in the state government. George Shoup, now representing Idaho as a senator, recommended John for the position of U.S. Marshal for the state of Idaho in 1897. The details of this conversation between Governor Frank Studenberg and John Springer remain unknown, but for whatever reason, the Idaho Statesman reported that John turned down the position to the disappointment of many. At 51, John decided to pursue his true passion in life, horse racing. For the next 20 years, John and Louisa remained busy. The couple eventually bought a house off Warm Springs on Locust and Bannock Street, less than a mile from where we are currently recording this episode. John volunteered time helping the Elks Club and the Masonic Club, and above all, the Owyhee County Fair, where he served both as a treasurer and secretary. But friends described him as having little interest in clubs, lodges, or politics. During this time, John continued to invest in lands, mines, and restaurants, but his largest focus lay in horse racing. I have over 100 articles discussing John's work in racing, training, and selling horses. Some of my personal favorite horses he worked with include names such as Rattler, Daisy, Lady Alfred, and Cyrus. Of course, his most famous horse, Samoa Girl, won a purse of $5,000 in one night, which is about $175,000 in modern currency.
Wow. Those are some great names, too.
John sold Samoa Girl to actress Loda Crabtree, an early star of the silent film era, referred to as the nation's darling, and one of the most famous women of the turn of the century.
Early Hollywood actually was super into horse racing. Like, it was very common to see the celebrities at the horse races, and several, of course, you know, in the same way we see them collect things today, they all had horses, and a lot of them had ranches. So, like, I'm not surprised. Like, horse racing was big out in LA.
Due to the demands of horse racing, John and Louisa traveled frequently, spending a considerable amount of time in California and Oregon. In 1913, John bid farewell to one of his dearest friends and family members when his brother Amos died at 73. However, the year also held happy occasions. John and Louisa's daughter Alice married Ralph Reed on September 2nd, coinciding with the 36th wedding anniversary of the parents. 3 years later, Alice gave birth to the first child, whom she named John after her father. She went on to have a daughter named Louisa, named after her mother, and 2 more sons named Nathan and Harold. On March 25th, 1922, John Davidson Springer passed away at the age of 75 in Boise, Idaho, after a long illness. The headlines announced, John D. Springer, beloved pioneer called by death. Residence of Idaho for 56 years passes after lingering illness. Old-timer of the state, fearless and just, mourned by all. When it came to time to find a burial plot, John's family faced a challenging decision. Most of John's family had been laid to rest in Maine, and with the exception of a few, such as his brother Albert, buried in Nevada, and Amos in Washington. Louisa and Alice would eventually be buried in California, where they would move after John's death. With no family plots in Idaho, Louise chose to have John interred with the Stoddard family at Morris Hill Cemetery, with whom he was very close in life. The Stoddard plots were located near the Eastman plots, where Louisa's sister and brother-in-law would also be buried. Tragedy briefly struck the funeral when Alice and her husband, Ralph, learned their children had been involved in an automobile accident while attending the service. Fortunately, none of the injuries proved serious, and the rest of the funeral proceeded smoothly. Around 125 people, including 20 family members, attended the funeral. John's final request was that the service be free from excessive ceremony and sorrow. Reverend Jones, selected by John to deliver the eulogy, remarked on John's disdain of church, describing him as, quote,
a Christian and a man who was, in the accepted use of the phrase, an unprofessing Christian.
With that sermon, John was laid to rest, surrounded by friends and family and the respect of the community he had served for so long. At this point in my research, I've gathered over 500 pages of historical documents on the life of John Springer. After spending so many hours with his story, I've certainly developed my own opinions about who I think he was. But in the end, all I truly know is the historical record. I never knew John personally. For that reason, I believe it's more appropriate to let people who did know him share their thoughts on the man. Here's what Governor James Hawley had to say about our Silver City sheriff.
I knew John Springer over 40 years, both in Silver City and in Boise. He was one of the best men I ever knew, in office or out of office. I don't believe there was a better man in the state of Idaho. He was square and absolutely fearless. He was generous. Everyone had a high regard for him. As a matter of fact, I cannot say too much good of him, nor can I express in words the regard in which I held him. He was a man whom one could tie to. He was all man.
Boise pioneer Max Mayfield added this.
Mr. Springer was one of the squarest men I ever knew. He kept his word and always fulfilled his obligations. He was generous. Everybody liked him. He was the sort of man who would go to any length for one whom he liked. He was an absolutely fearless man and a good American citizen.
Finally, friend and Idaho lawyer J.L. Reed shared what John's final days were like.
John D. Springer was one of the most fearless men I ever met. There was no squarer man lived than he. I was with him night and day during the last month, and all through that time he looked on his passing as he would on a journey. He had often said,
I have no religion but the golden rule.
And he lived that every day. He had a big heart and was as sympathetic as a woman.
Sorry. I hate to laugh there.
That's supposed to be a burn? Or
he was all man except he had feelings.
He had emotions and it cared for people. He was like a woman. Oh. Get out of here.
Get out of here.
No friend ever came to him at a time of trouble or want, but what John Springer did, everything he could for him.
The man who comes to take Lockhart out of this hotel without a warrant will die before he reaches the head of the stairs.
And if they receive something of the coloring of romance, it may be traced to feelings that grow out of the occasion.
I'm gonna die for a crime today, for which other men should die as well as myself.
During his life, John Springer was a lot of things. He was a husband, brother, and son, but he was also deputy, a warden, and a sheriff who refused to use a gun.
You don't dare pull the trigger. You don't dare shoot. You yell. Give me the gun. To think that I have to end the life of a man who, no matter what he did to others, never injured me. It is terrible. There is no place like home.
The son of a sea captain, a racer of horses, an executioner, a shepherd. But more than anything, the one word everyone used the most when describing him, John Springer was fearless. My sources for this episode are newspapers.com, ancestry.com, familysearch.com, findagraves.com, the Owyhee Outlook, Owyhee County by Robert L. Dean, True West, War Under the Mountain in Orlando, Rube Robbins by R.J. Robertson, because I just couldn't help myself from using a True West article. That's too fun. National Maritime Historical Society, and The People of Maine, A Studying Value, and of course the incredible book, Hanged. After a project where we accessed over 500 historical documents, there are many people to thank. First, a big thank you to the Kennebec Historical Society for providing invaluable information about John's family. I'm also grateful to Owen over at the archives for helping me track down some of these family photos. Huge thank you to Kathy Hill. If the McDonald story was confusing to you, you should have read the entire thing. I was giving a much abbreviated version. There were so many letters and so many conflicting statements. It was really hard to sort through. Kathy Hill, the author of Hang, not only gave us access to her historical documents that she'd collected for the project, she also gave us her handwritten notes, and I use that more for this project than I ever have with one of these executions. Kathy Hill is incredible. Please read her book, Hanged. It will not disappoint. It is awesome.
It's available in our gift shop, and yes, it is an incredible resource that I use regularly, like Skye's research.
Mm-hmm.
However, the biggest thank you by far goes to the Owyhee Historical Society. Their staff and volunteers spent months collaborating with us on this project. Special thanks to Deb and Ann for giving me a tour of Silver City and helping me locate all the key sites where this story unfolded. I stayed at the Idaho Hotel that weekend and had a wonderful experience.
Yeah, I've stayed in that too. Oh my gosh, how cool is that?
I highly recommend it if you ever get the chance. The atmosphere is rustic, a bit spooky, and the food is absolutely terrific. I was not expecting the food to be so stellar.
Absolutely.
So good. My final thank you goes to Margaret, one of the Owyhee volunteers who pulled over 280 historical documents for me and spent countless hours sorting through material that might aid in this project. We truly cannot thank her enough for all her dedication and hard work. And lastly, thank you to every fan who made it through this 2-hour episode. Your support is always appreciated.
Oh my gosh, take a break. That was amazing. Nice job. You know, we always look for redemptive stories about people who are incarcerated here, but then to find a guy who's fearless and square, but in a way that's not derogatory, that's a great thing, that he's a man of his morals and follows a mission to save society and make sure that this lawless West actually has some order so people can do their jobs and collect gold and make this nation wealthy and this area, this state wealthy, and just wild. And he's an amazing character. I really like this. An amazing figure.
I've covered a few law enforcers, Sheriff Fury, Sheriff Frank Canton, and Fury perhaps was a little inexperienced and Canton was obviously corrupt. So it was really refreshing to have a law enforcer who I kept on expecting to find bad things. I went through this entire project thinking no one's entire career is clean. And yet the more I dug, I only found more positive stuff about him. And the fact that no one could speak a bad word about him, how everyone just was oh, he's so kind, he's so generous, really makes you wonder what type of sheriff he was.
Yeah.
And how he treated people to earn such a reputation, which everyone just loved him.
To have so much heart as somebody who has to enforce law in this area. Oftentimes, with Snook, it just seemed like I'm doing my job. I'm pulling this lever, these executions. It's just I'm forced to do it. There's no thought. He seemed to be detached almost, where I feel like Springer had so much heart, and he was the heart of this city, which is wow. It's really cool.
Well, and the weight of executions. The weight on an executioner is often something we don't look at. We often talk about the condemned individual, and that's an important part of the story. This takes a mental toll on these guys.
Yeah.
Both with John and Amos, they seem to have aged dramatically during the years they were holding that badge down.
Oh.
All right. Well, Anthony, why don't you take us out?
All right, everybody. We love you. Thank you so much. Have a great holiday season. Have a great weekend. Do your own time.
Do your own number.
Be fearless.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.
Special thanks to voice actors Jack Horikage, Raven Brown, Tristan Hafer, Jerry Broad, Rob Goodwin, Kane Scaffer, Eric Overzet, Mariah Villefanier, Virgil Clark, Rachel Enfant, and Brady McGurr. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode. New this season, Samuel, Bryn, and Mariah, staff members at the site, and myself, we've been going out into the prison yard and interviewing visitors. Some familiar with the podcast and others who are visiting for the very first time. We just want to capture what is their experience at the old pen like.
What was the highlight of your visit today, and what did you find the most enjoyable?
I definitely liked all the little facts that were around, so that you knew what went on here, the inmates, and how they lived their life in here. Surprisingly cooler in the buildings than I thought it was going to be. I did not realize that there was actually, I was thinking, oh my god, it's going to be miserable walking in them, being these big stone buildings.
Was there anything about the history of the old Idaho Penitentiary that took you by surprise, and if so, what was it?
How long it was open. was pretty surprising. And the wall, that it was actually built by the inmates, that they mined the rocks and built the wall themselves. That's kind of crazy.
Did you have any like other assumptions about the penitentiary before you came here?
I thought it was going to be smaller. It was actually really big and held a lot of people. Nicer than I thought it was going to be, like the rose garden. I thought they brought in later.
Do you have anything else to say before we close things?
I can tell you that it's haunted.
Which building do you think is the most haunted?
Solitary confinement.
Really? Why do you think that one's haunted?
You walk in and you get sick to your stomach and just don't feel right in there.
Yeah, it's just kind of super cramped or...
Not just that, it's just the air.
The air?
Different.